convoy and protest has been encamped now for going on 3 weeks here in the nation's capital. Before the Prime Minister speaks, though, we're going to take you to Coutts, Alberta. The RCMP are addressing the media. 11 people were arrested earlier today with a significant cache of weapons. Let's listen in live.
Came at one of our members in the vehicle and they had to avoid him, and then ended up with a tractor trailer semi that was involved in a coordinated effort, and it was in an attempt to push or ram our police vehicle. From there, the occupants of the two vehicles ran and ended up going into an area where the protesters were located. We were able to identify one of the males that were driving one of the vehicles, and our investigation is continuing. We know who that person is, and we will release information upon that person's arrest. Our members have been up here, and in general, we haven't had many incidents involving violence, but unfortunately an investigation started after a period of time. When the initial protesters arrived, shortly thereafter we began to receive imminent information of potential threats. It took some time to investigate that and to determine facts, which have led us to several arrests during the night last night. These arrests and this investigation is continuing. We have since made another arrest involving this. The escalation of violence towards the members, including having someone break one of our checkpoints this afternoon and just about hit one of our members on the road. So we certainly have concerns about how this has developed, and our investigation into what could be a number of different charges and a number of different acts has created a situation where we're investigating conspiracy to attempt to commit murder. And then we have other investigations involving the firearms, clearly. So a search warrant was conducted last night it was approximately midnight, 12:30, where 3 trailers associated to a group that had arrived separate to the original protesters, but ended up being a part of this whole situation. And this group, we conducted a search warrant into 3 trailers associated to them, resulting in the seizure of weapons, firearms, ammunition, as well as body-worn armor that would normally be a police issue. And these people were taken into custody. We have determined that the investigation is ongoing, and we will continue to investigate this for the safety of the public and for the safety of the police. It's important for us to say that our message has always been to have the public safe and the police safe, and as more and more information came to light, it was important for us to have people leave the illegal blockade. We encouraged people to leave, and unfortunately we were able to, with the province of Alberta, secure an area for people to move to peacefully protest, that we're interested in continuing to protest. And at this point, we hadn't had a lot of people go there. They wanted to remain at the location, both here at Milk River and Coutts. And we ended up having to act on our information due to the totality of the situation and obviously the increased danger to our police. And ultimately, if the police are at a risk, the public is at a risk, because we need to protect the public, and we can't have our situation be where we don't have the ability to defend ourselves and then on top of that defend the public. The threats were taken, the time was taken to investigate them to get to this point, and our investigation is continuing. This isn't over at this point. We have to continue to look into things. We have asked for people to leave and continue to ask for people to leave. We continue to ask for people to stay away, because we couldn't guarantee at one point where things were going to go with regards to the safety of the members. And as soon as it escalated to the point that a decision had to be made, we acted. And like I said, this was a very complex, layered investigation. And some people might ask why it took so long. These investigations aren't necessarily easy. We have a team of people that are dedicated to investigate them. And it took to the point where we knew what was about to happen or inevitably to happen, and we acted as soon as we could. Any questions?
So the trailers, they were here in Coots, they were in Milk River. When did they arrive? And if they were in Coots, how did they get here because they were police checked?
Yeah, I don't know when they arrived. They were here in Coots.
Can you take me through the volatility that has seemingly escalated in the last little bit here and how members on the ground are feeling?
Well, all of us are dedicated to serving the province of Alberta and our citizens. And it's troubling if you have people that are here to cause harm to our own members. And we just want everyone to be safe. And that was our entire effort here. We wanted people to move away from the illegal blockade because of safety issues, and we wanted to have this resolved where people could safely use the highway and the border to get across to do their business and to do their personal work, and that was blockaded. And then to have people coming as well, like with heavy equipment, and you guys have probably heard that 3 large pieces of equipment were, stopped from being able to be used. And that was because our investigation led us that those pieces of equipment were coming here. And we told them not to come here, and we asked them to leave. And then the risk is that if we can't have more heavy equipment coming here for a fortification, and they needed to go, and they didn't. So part of our situation is protecting the public, but also not allowing it to go beyond that.
The trucks where you found the weapons, were they located on the road in the blockade or elsewhere in Coots?
So we've had different arrests. The majority of the weapons that we located were in the 3 trailers. And then earlier today we had an arrest on the highway where two firearms were seized and a person was arrested as well.
But the trucks that you discovered the weapons in, were they in the blockade on the road, or were they off the blockade in a field or in the town of village of Coots?
No, one of them was on the highway coming here, and due to imminent threat, we located that vehicle and arrested that person. And then we had 3 trailers, and I say trailers as in not a truck or a tractor, but 3 trailers that were here where a stash of weapons was located, including firearms, long barrel weapons, and you have the list.
In town or
in town here, associated down the road here.
Is the conspiracy to commit murder charge, is that in the incident in the trailers and that vehicle with all the...
That's correct.
Okay, and can you tell me what the status of those people who are charged? Are they in custody? What's going on with them?
Yeah, we have people in custody, and they have a court process that takes place where I don't believe any of them have had an information sworn where they would be charged as of yet. And once that happens, we'll do another release to update you all on that, and including the charges that are considered.
So I spoke to one of the protest organizers. Before you put your release out, I have to be transparent about that. And the account that I got was very different than what the RCMP is saying. One, that the truck and the trailer that were involved in the incident, that they were just basically warming their batteries up and driving around. Is is there a possibility that was what happened?
The investigation that led to that situation is not them warming up their vehicles and just moving around. They came at our member in a vehicle that was parked on the road doing a block, and that member had to move to avoid being pushed by this huge piece of equipment. And then the other vehicle that was utilized was involved as well. It was, in my opinion, coordinated, and that will be resolved at court.
Protest organizers in Ottawa have already said that the police here are essentially lying, that this is not true. There are certainly a number of people in the protests here that have that belief as well. How do you convince them that what you're saying is true?
The truth is that this absolutely took place, and I'm not going to argue with somebody who isn't going to listen to the facts. I have no intention of doing that. There are people with all sorts of opinions, but the truth is that there's a heavy stash of weapons, and these weapons were brought by people who had the intent on causing harm. And there are also people here who are here to protest, and they very likely didn't know what was going on here, but that is not up to me to decide as to what level things are at. And you can imagine our situation, and some people have asked for pictures, and I'm sure they will come, but people have to accept the truth and understand our situation is to protect the public, and in order to do that, we act on facts.
Do you think you got them all?
The investigation continues, and if there's more to be found, we will find them.
That doesn't really answer that question, though. Do you think you got them all, and are you worried there might be more?
I don't know. I'm not the investigator. I certainly hope that if there is a situation where there's someone else involved, that arrests happen.
So for clarity, the investigation into the charge of conspiracy to attempt murder, that the intended target was an RCMP officer.
Yeah, I don't know the fine details of the investigation. I just know that a threat was against our members in general, and that, as you saw in the brief, that we had to act on that information.
In your release, you referred to it as organized crime. What do you mean by that? What sort of organization are we talking about?
I think that the investigation will reveal the in-depthness of that. I don't know the exact characterization that it would be to lead this, but there's certainly a group that came in after the initial group arrived within days, and then this action began. And it came to a point where for the safety of the members and for the safety of the public, we certainly had to act and act quickly.
You say that this group was sort of embedded in the larger group. Is that a fair assessment of it?
Yes, we had, and we had also the difficulty of having two locations of unlawful protest separated by 18 kilometers. So we had two different groups of people, and I don't know how in depth their involvement is. I don't know how many numbers of people were involved in this, but that's up to the investigators to ensure that it continues to be investigated.
So is there a possibility that this group that you arrested were acting completely in their own silo and without others in the protest knowing about them?
I don't know. That's going to come out through evidence at court, I'm sure.
I know you did just want to speak to the events that have unfolded, but can you give any update on what's next from police and the RCMP?
What's next is we're going to ensure that this border is opened and stays open safely, and that the public is able to use the highways and use the border as it's meant to be. And certainly our opinion is that any sort of protest that continues after this point, the government of Alberta has provided us equipment that we're going to use to remove people. And as I've said all along, the best way to get the vehicles off the road is to have people take them off themselves and drive away. And if we have to come back and charge people, we will.
Any timeline on that? Getting things open?
Well, the border needs to open, so it's very important. And we already have people, I've been advised, pulling out and leaving. And I guess we'll see how long that takes. Our goal has always remained that we understand, and everyone does, that Canadians have the right to peaceful protest in a lawful location and in a lawful process. And clearly that didn't happen here, and we acted on that.
As you mentioned, the province has supplied them, or at least is going to supply the vehicles or the machinery that's necessary to clear these roadblocks. Is that machinery here now?
It's coming today, if not already here.
So 11 people arrested at the time of the release, one more, a 12th person since then, and then what about the arrival of the tractor? Is he or she being
we're working on that. I don't know where that stands. Yeah. It's a big piece of farm equipment to have coming at you.
Are you making any special efforts to document the work of the officers in the field?
Document the work of this. This is a big investigation, and we're documenting things, yes.
What percentage of the officers are wearing body cams?
I don't have that information.
And then, sorry, the driver of the semi-trailer, have they been identified? Have they been arrested?
Oh, the semi-truck? I don't have that information. I know that they were able to ID for sure one person, and the investigation continues.
Are all the people arrested Canadian citizens?
I don't have that information. I can't comment on that. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, you've been listening to a live update from the RCMP in Coutts, Alberta, where, as you heard there, a number of arrests have been made overnight. 11 people were arrested, and possibly more. They were charged with a variety of charges in relation to a cache of weapons that the RCMP found in 3 trailers over the course of the past week or so, where they were investigating. But they also say that they are also charging at least one person with conspiracy to commit murder, and that is in relation to a large vehicle or a tractor that tried to ram into a police vehicle. And the RCMP viewed that as a threat against their members. So very serious escalation of things in Coutts, Alberta, although the police point out this was a small group of people that arrived that were not part of the original protest. It all happens, of course, though, on a day when we are expecting to hear from the Prime Minister in about 15 minutes' time on the federal cabinet's decision to invoke the Emergencies Act to allow the federal government to take extraordinary measures to respond to these kinds of events. There's lots of details that we still don't know yet, but let's bring in some of my colleagues to help us understand where things are at for now. The CBC's Hannah Thibodeau is standing by, and David Cochrane, too, who is guest hosting Power and Politics. He is here as well. I'm going to start with you, David, in terms of what we know or what we hope to know from the Prime Minister in about 10 minutes' time.
Yeah, we certainly know that the Prime Minister is intent on moving ahead with use of the Emergencies Act. The first time that's happened in this country. It's the successor to the War Measures Act, which his father famously used during the FLQ crisis. This is a law that is a successor to that one, but it is far more limited in scope. And our understanding from talking to provincial sources who were briefed today and federal sources who are aware of what's going on is that the measures that the Prime Minister announces today will be limited in both time and in scope. I mean, the immediate and urgent concerns are what's happening with the occupation of the downtown core of the capital city right here in Ottawa, which is on about day 20 now, with hundreds to thousands of people at any given time, dozens to hundreds of trucks clogging up the downtown, making the Prime Minister's office itself inaccessible and generally making life miserable for people who live in the downtown. And then there are, of course, the protests, like the one we saw at the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor, which clogged up the most important trade artery maybe on the planet for several days. $300 to $500 million worth of trade went across that bridge every single day. So all of these things taken together with Coutts and everything constitutes a national emergency in the view of the federal government. So the measures today, an emergency cabinet meeting last night during the Super Bowl on a Sunday night, a caucus meeting this morning, and then a meeting with the First Ministers today, and now a conversation with the country to some degree from the Prime Minister outlining exactly what these things will be. The specifics, exactly how it will work in each specific area, isn't at all clear right now, but federal officials I've been speaking with today have made it clear that their goal here is to protect critical infrastructure and supplement the needs of local, municipal, and provincial law enforcement as necessary. Doug Ford, we know, the Ontario Premier, made it clear in the First Minister's meeting that he wants the help, that he needs the help, lamenting the fact that you can't even get tow trucks to come in and tow trucks away because the death threats and fear that some tow companies feel, and also the fact that some tow truck companies even support these movements. So there is a sense of helplessness, certainly here in the capital city, and a growing sense of frustration to the point, Rosie, that we have seen groups of ordinary citizens go out and take matters into their own hand, creating citizens' blockades to keep the trucks out of the downtown core. The counter-protesters, the risk of escalation, the possibility of a flashpoint of violence, all of this was discussed this morning, and the consensus is that over the objections of some premiers, that the Prime Minister will invoke the Emergency Act in a limited fashion to get control of the capital city and protect the border crossings with the United States.
And we'll talk more about some of those concerns from premiers, but just to remind viewers who are just tuning in that this will be the first time this kind of legislation, or this legislation in particular, has ever been used. It was created in 1988 in Brian Mulroney's government after the War Measures Act, which, as David alluded to there, was used by Justin Trudeau's father in response to the FLQ crisis in Quebec in the 1970s. And it was a completely different act. It suspended civil liberties and allowed police to arrest hundreds of people at once. That is not what is on the table anymore. This legislation, as David points out, limited in scope and makes sure that there is no I guess abuse of power would be the best way to put it. Hannah Thibodeau has been following the reaction from provinces, and there has been a lot of reaction, and not everyone is on the same page, to say the least, Hannah.
Yeah, absolutely. Under this Emergencies Act, what you have to do, what is required of the Prime Minister, is that he must consult the provinces. So he consulted the provinces early this morning in a First Minister's meeting. And when consulting with those provinces, we heard from a lot of those premiers afterwards saying that they're not interested in having this apply to their province in particular. They can't veto this by any means. However, we heard from for example, Alberta Premier Jason Kenney. He says that they are fine with the situation there. You saw the situation in Coutts, Alberta, where the RCMP feel they have that well underhand. And he also said, along with Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, that he felt by invoking the Emergency Measures Act, that it would embolden the protesters. So those two provinces are against it. Also, Quebec was one of the provinces we figured would be against this as well. They feel it's their jurisdiction. They feel their SQ, it's called, their police force in that province, has matters well underhand as well. Manitoba against this, New Brunswick coming out saying it's not necessary as well, but all of them couching it as well, Rosemary, saying that if it is needed in the national capital area, they understand that, but also citing the fact that police were able to get the situation at the Ambassador Bridge under control within a couple of days, too. That was up almost a week, but it took them about 2 days before they cleared the trucks, and they have the vehicles flowing again there today. But there are provinces that are in favor of this. And one of the big provinces is the province that we live in, Ontario. And we heard from Premier Doug Ford a little bit earlier today. Here's what he had to say.
I'll support the federal government in any proposals they have to bring law and order back to our province, to make sure we stabilize our businesses and trade around the world as the world is watching us right now, wondering if it's a stable environment to open up businesses and expand businesses. These occupiers, they're doing the total opposite, what they say they're there to do.
So clearly, Doug Ford wants the help. In particular, looking at the Ottawa situation, we heard from David there that, over the weekend, we have seen maybe they're peaceful, but they're lawless. They are not following the rules of this city, and it's been almost 3 weeks now, and there was very little sighting of police in this city. To get this under control, the Ottawa police, the Ottawa mayor have said they need about 1,800 more officers to get this under control here in this city. Whether they have those numbers is still unclear as well. I was working this weekend. We couldn't get that answer from either the Ottawa police or the Ottawa mayor if they have that. But one of the things that the Ottawa mayor did do, Rosie, is he did negotiate a plan, some type of plan with one of the leaders. Her name is Tamara Leach. And what they did is now they're starting to move some of the trucks out of residential areas and putting them in that main area in front of Wellington Street. So smack dab in front of the Parliament buildings, as well as the Prime Minister's office. So they've started moving some of those trucks up there. So behind the scenes, we saw that the Ottawa mayor was able to negotiate some form of deal with one of the leaders, but then other leaders are coming out and telling truckers not to move their vehicles. So a lot of confusion about that.
Yeah, certainly an impasse in the nation's capital, and certainly a police force that seems to be overwhelmed, which is probably, at least in part, what the Prime Minister will point to when he explains to Canadians in just a few moments why this is needed and where it will apply to and what the goal is, what kind of measures this Emergencies Act will use. We are also to understand, as the leader of the Bloc Québécois told reporters just moments ago, that he has also, the Prime Minister, reached out to opposition leaders. He met with them last week, but we are told that he spoke to them today to, I imagine, brief them on the situation. The Bloc Québécois, perhaps not surprisingly, given Quebec's past experience with the War Measures Act, not in favour of the use of the Emergencies Act. Here's the leader of the Bloc, Yves-François Blanchet.
Stand clearly that Quebec government and us do not want this law to be implemented, on the territory of Quebec. It is not legitimate and it is useless. So we don't want it. And we don't want the extent of the powers that the federal government could give itself to go as far as eventually using the army. Obviously not in Quebec, but I believe nowhere. But this is a decision which is, or position which seems to be the decision of the government of Quebec as well as ours.
Just as a follow-up there, sir, what has been happening in Ottawa has spilled across bridges into Gatineau, into Chelsea, into Masson-Angers. This whole region has been affected, and that includes parts that are in Quebec. Should there not be some action for the greater Ottawa-Gatineau area? Does that not apply?
There is no civil disorder in Quebec now, which is not well contained by civil authorities and police.
That's the leader of the Bloc Québécois. Let's go outside, just outside of Parliament, of the Parliament buildings. Evan Dyer is down near the protesters. And before we get to the Prime Minister, Evan, I wanted to check in there with what you're hearing from protesters about the news that this is about to come from the Prime Minister.
Well, we did indeed hear some reaction, Rosie, and you won't be surprised if you've been speaking to these protesters, as so many of us have down here, to hear that their reaction is one of bravado, essentially, and saying that they're not going to alter their posture here. I mean, actually, as we just heard from Hannah, there have been some changes in their posture, but far from leaving the city, they've actually moved further downtown. I think perhaps we should just show you some of that briefly, because Wellington Street today looks quite different from how it did before. You can see all of these trucks parked like sardines, side by side. We saw about 14 or 15 trucks brought in here with police escort and basically stacked in this manner, tight together to vacate Albert Street a couple of blocks away from here as part of that agreement between the mayor and organizer Tamara Litch that Hannah was referring to. So definitely a relief, I guess, for the people who live on Albert Street, but an added complication here on Wellington Street, making all of this even harder to remove, even harder to tow if it ever does come to that. Some protesters responded today to this announcement of an Emergencies Act by saying, well, it's not justified, it's not called for, it's too much. Others were simply defiant. Let's listen to two.
Acting like a bunch of spoiled kids throwing a temper tantrum, really. I mean, Emergencies Act for kids playing hockey in the street and bouncy castles. No, come down here and talk to us and listen. Like, let's move ahead with this. And all they want to do is they just want to use the iron fist. And they want to force us out that way.
We've got so many people, even if they try and put in an emergency act, whatever that entitles, they can't do anything to us. Like, they can try and take down a few people, but we've got so many people that they can't stop us all.
So there you go, some defiance there from protesters, other protesters saying that they find these measures excessive, but nobody we met today told us that they plan to leave Ottawa as a result of this.
Evan Dyer, thank you for that. Evan Dyer on Parliament Hill, giving us the latest on the convoy. The Prime Minister speaking in just moments.
This is a CBC News special presentation.
Hello there, I'm Rosemary Barton here in the nation's capital. We want to welcome our viewers now on CBC Television and CBC News Network. You are watching special coverage this hour as we await the Prime Minister of Canada to tell us what we have been reporting through the day, that his government, his cabinet, is set to take an unprecedented step in response to these protests, convoys and blockades that have occurred across the country. The biggest one here in the nation's capital, going on almost 3 weeks now, day 18 of the nation's capital being held hostage, essentially, by these protesters. The act, the Emergencies Act, has never been used since its creation in 1988. It will give the federal government extra powers, specific powers for a limited period of time to deal with the protests across the country. It is unclear at this hour if they will be applied nationwide or to specific regions of the country where these protests have broken out. As you know, if you've been following these protests, these are largely people who oppose vaccine mandates and other public health restrictions. Some people who oppose vaccines entirely and have been demanding that the federal government remove mandates that they put in place. Certainly some provinces moving in that direction already. Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario signaling that as well today. But there have been also threats and promises to try and overthrow the government, the democratically elected government of this country. The protests have not been violent, but they have been threatening and intimidating for many people who live in the nation's capital. And the police of this city have been overwhelmed. We will see what the Prime Minister has to say and how he justifies the use of this unprecedented measure and how it will apply in the case here in Ottawa and perhaps in other parts of the country too. We've got both the CBC's Hannah Thibodeau and David Cochrane standing by for analysis and reaction. And you saw too Evan Dyer, he's outside getting reaction from the protesters who for now, as he was telling us, remain defiant in the face of the use of the Emergencies Act. I'll start with David again if I can. Obviously, I'll cut you off as soon as we see the Prime Minister appearing, David. I think it ramped up over the weekend, this conversation around the use of the Emergencies Act. Bill Blair did tell me that it had been on the table from the get-go. But it'll be interesting to hear from the Prime Minister what led them to believe that this was the only way out of this situation, provided, of course, that it does result in some sort of denouement.
Yeah, Rosie, a little bit more information that we've got just now, just to let you know what we're hearing. And my colleague Chris Hall has also gotten some of this information. We're going to get the proclamation of the emergency today, but we may not get some of the very specific measures until tomorrow. But as we've been talking about throughout the day, the measures are going to be limited in scope. They're going to be time limited. This will not be, these measures under the Emergency Act will not apply countrywide, but will focus on specific areas, most notably here in the capital city, the national capital here in Ottawa, and at border crossings. I've been hearing from high-level officials all day that the idea is to protect critical infrastructure, clear it out, keep it clear, and then supplement the needs and the abilities of local and provincial law enforcement to deal with this. And they're also, so to do that is going to be things like granting the RCMP the authority to assist in enforcement of municipal and provincial laws, like here in Ottawa. They can come in and start enforcing some of the bylaws and these things that are, or the injunction on blowing horns that are being openly ignored 20 days or so into this occupation. And there's also going to be an intention announced to go after the financing of these movements in some form. Okay. I'm going to be quiet now because I see the Prime Minister is there.
That's right. Here's the Prime Minister of Canada, flanked by some of his cabinet ministers, to tell us what we've been reporting all day, that he will, and his cabinet will invoke the Emergency Measures Act.
Par la vice-première ministre Freeland et les ministres Lemitti, Mendicino et Blair.
Lemitti, Mendicino,
Je suis ici pour faire le point sur les barrages.
I'm here to give you an update on the illegal blockades and tell you about our efforts to support Ukraine facing potential Russian invasion. But let's begin with the situation here in Canada, of course.
Illegal blockades that have been disrupting the lives of too many Canadians. Here in our capital city, families and small businesses have been enduring illegal obstruction of their neighborhoods, occupying streets, harassing people, breaking the law. This is not a peaceful protest. At the borders in different parts of the country, the blockades are harming our economy and endangering public safety. Critical supply chains have been disrupted, This is hurting workers who rely on these jobs to feed their families. Yesterday, the Ambassador Bridge was reopened between Windsor and Detroit. Our team and I have been working with Ontario and the City of Windsor around the clock. I want to thank the officers on the ground, including the RCMP, who played an active role. We now have a responsibility to make sure that the bridge stays open. With each illegal blockade, local law enforcement agencies have been acting to keep the peace within their jurisdiction. Despite their best efforts, it is now clear that there are serious challenges to law enforcement's ability to effectively enforce the law. On Friday, Ontario invoked a state of emergency to respond to the blockades. This was the responsible and necessary thing to do. Today, to continue building on these efforts, the federal government is ready to use more tools at its disposal to get the situation fully under control. After discussing with Cabinet and caucus, after consultation with premiers from all provinces and territories, after speaking with opposition leaders, the federal government has invoked the Emergencies Act to supplement provincial and territorial capacity to address the blockades and occupations. I want to be very clear. The scope of these measures will be time-limited, geographically targeted, as well as reasonable and proportionate to the threats they are meant to address. The Emergencies Act will be used to strengthen and support law enforcement agencies at all levels across the country. This is about keeping Canadians safe, protecting people's jobs, and restoring confidence in our institutions. Here's how the measures we're taking today will help get the situation under control. The police will be given more tools to restore order in places where public assemblies can constitute illegal and dangerous activities, such as blockades and occupations, as seen in Ottawa, the Ambassador Bridge, and elsewhere. These tools include strengthening their ability to impose fines or imprisonment. The government will designate, secure, and protect places and infrastructure that are critical to our economy and people's jobs, including border crossings and airports. We cannot and will not allow illegal and dangerous activities to continue. The Emergencies Act will also allow the government to make sure essential services are rendered, for example, in order to tow vehicles blocking roads. In addition, financial institutions will be authorized or directed to render essential services to help address the situation, including by regulating and prohibiting the use of property to fund or support illegal blockades. And finally, will enable the RCMP to enforce municipal bylaws and provincial offences where required. This is what the Emergencies Act does. Let me be equally clear about what it does not do. We're not using the Emergencies Act to call in the military. We're not suspending fundamental rights or overriding the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We are not limiting people's freedom of speech. We are not limiting freedom of peaceful assembly. We are not preventing people from exercising their right to protest legally. We are reinforcing the principles, values, and institutions that keep all Canadians free. Après des discussions avec le Conseil des ministres et le caucus,
with Cabinet and caucus, after consulting the premiers of all provinces and territories, and after speaking with the leaders of the opposition parties, the federal government has invoked the Emergency Measures Act to complete provincial and territorial powers in order to manage the illegal blockades and occupations. I want to be very clear. These measures will be limited in time and geographically targeted. They will be reasonable, they will be proportional to the threats to Canada's security. The Emergency Measures Act will strengthen and support the work by the police. We are not using the Emergency Measures Act in order to deploy the military. We will not be suspending fundamental rights, as articulated in the Charter of Rights and Freedom. We are not limiting the right to peacefully protest or assemble. What we want to do is protecting Canadians, protecting their jobs, and reinstating confidence in our institutions.
Something that's been used ever, but it exists for a reason. Invoking the Emergencies Act is never the first thing a government should do, nor even the second. The Act is to be used sparingly and as a last resort. Right now, the situation requires additional tools not held by any other federal, provincial, or territorial law. Today, in these circumstances, it is now clear that responsible leadership requires us to do this. These measures must be and will be compliant with our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Indeed, the Emergencies Act was created in the late 80s to flow from and uphold the Charter. We'll always defend the rights of Canadians to peaceful assembly and to freedom of expression, but these blockades are illegal, and if you're still participating, the time to go home is now. On a separate track from the Emergencies Act, I want to reassure people that the Canadian Border Services Agency is already turning back non-Canadians trying to enter Canada to participate in blockades. And of course, while we get the situation under control, we'll continue to have Canadians' backs. I want to remind affected businesses that if you're facing revenue losses, support is available through our wage and rent subsidy programs. We know that downtown Ottawa businesses in particular have been hard hit by these illegal activities. In the coming days, we'll be launching specific support for those businesses. I know that everyone is tired of this pandemic. We're hearing your frustration with COVID and even with the temporary measures we had to put forward to keep people safe. I know people are frustrated. I hear it. You have a right to express that frustration and even your anger with the government or government policies. It's something we'll always defend in this free and democratic country. But blockading streets and critical infrastructure and depriving your neighbors of their freedoms is a totally different thing. It has to stop. Tout le monde est fatigué de la pandémie. Il y a d'autres façons de vous exprimer que de participer à des
Other ways to
activités.
express yourselves rather than participating in illegal activities and dangerous activities. As Mr. Duclos said last week, public health measures are constantly being reassessed, and we will continue to modify them according to science. In fact, we will be making some announcements on that subject in the coming days.
Today, I also want to speak briefly about our support for Ukraine. On Saturday, I spoke with President Zelensky to reaffirm Canada's steadfast support and to continue to do whatever we can to support Ukraine. Durant la fin de semaine, j'ai aussi des appels avec le président du Conseil
I also
européen,
spoke to the Charles Michel, as well as Chancellor Scholz of Germany and President Duda of Poland.
Part of the collective G7 response to support Ukraine's economic resilience, today we're announcing that Canada will offer a loan of up to $500 million to the government of Ukraine, I want to thank Deputy Prime Minister Freeland for her leadership on this file and underline that this is in addition to the $120 million loan offered earlier in January. On top of financial support, Canada has already taken steps to help Ukraine defend itself, including with the extension of the training mission Operation Unifier. In light of the seriousness of the situation and following conversations with our Ukrainian partners, I've approved the provision of $7.8 million worth of lethal equipment and ammunition. This responds to Ukraine's specific request and is in addition to the non-lethal equipment we've already provided. The intent of this support from Canada and other partners is to deter further Russian aggression. En raison du sérieux de la situation,
Given the seriousness of the situation, and after having closely studied the issue, I asked, I told Ukraine we would send them arms and munitions. So Canada is joining the United States, the UK, Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Lithuania, the Netherlands, and Poland in sending arms. The goal of this support from Canada and our other partners is to dissuade Russia from pursuing its aggression towards Ukraine.
Confrontation with Russia. But the situation is intensifying rapidly, and we are showing our resolve. It's important for Canadians and the world to know that Canada will continue supporting Ukraine and its independence, integrity, sovereignty, including its right to defend itself. Merci tout le monde. Je cède maintenant la parole à la vice-première ministre.
I will now give the floor to Deputy Prime Minister Freeland.
Merci, Monsieur le
Thank you, Prime Minister. Hello, everyone. Across the world, liberal democracies are being confronted with serious and repeated threats. We thought, and we perhaps even hoped, that Canada would be spared. For the last 2.5 weeks, we have realized that this is not the case. This siege and these blockades are causing major damage to our economy and are harming our democratic institutions as well as Canada's reputation in the world. International confidence towards Canada as a good place to invest and do business has been shaken.
barricades are doing great damage to Canada's economy and to our reputation as a reliable trading partner. The blockade of the Ambassador Bridge has affected about $390 million in trade each day. This bridge supports 30% of all trade by road between Canada and the United States, our most important trading partner. In Coutts, Alberta, about $48 million in daily trade has been affected by the blockades. In Emerson, Manitoba, about $73 million in daily trade has been affected by the blockades. These costs are real. They threaten businesses, big and small, and they threaten the livelihoods of Canadian workers, just as we are all working so hard to recover from the economic damage caused by COVID. Nous nous sommes battus bec et ongle.
We fought so hard to protect Canada's privileged relationship with the United States when we were negotiating NAFTA. We stood up to Tariff 232, which were illegals and unjustified. We will never let those hard-won victories be tarnished. The world is watching us. Our jobs, our prosperity, and our livelihoods are in danger. That is why our government is acting. We are resolute and determined. These illegal blockades must be lifted, and they will be.
Invoking the Emergencies Act, we are announcing the following immediate actions. First, we are broadening the scope of Canada's anti-money laundering and terrorist financing rules so that they cover crowdfunding platforms and the payment service providers they use. These changes cover all forms of transactions, including digital assets, such as cryptocurrencies. The illegal blockades have highlighted the fact that crowdfunding platforms and some of the payment service providers they use are not fully captured under the Proceeds of Crime and Terrorist Financing Act. Our banks and financial institutions are already obligated to report to the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Centre of Canada, or FINTRAC. As of today, all crowdfunding platforms and the payment service providers they use must register with FINTRAC, and they must report large and suspicious transactions to FINTRAC. This will help mitigate the risk that these platforms receive illicit funds, increase the quality and quantity of intelligence received by FINTRAC, and make more information available to support investigations by law enforcement into these illegal blockades. We are making these changes because we know that these platforms are being used to support illegal blockades and illegal activity, which is damaging the Canadian economy. The government will also bring forward legislation to provide these authorities to FINTRAC on a permanent basis. Second, the government is issuing an order with immediate effect under the Emergencies Act, authorizing Canadian financial institutions to temporarily cease providing financial services where the institution suspects that an account is being used to further the illegal blockades and occupations. This order covers both personal and corporate accounts. Third, we are directing Canadian financial institutions to review their relationships with anyone involved in the illegal blockades and report to the RCMP or CSIS. As of today, a bank or other financial service provider will be able to immediately freeze or suspend an account without a court order. In doing so, they will be protected against civil liability for actions taken in good faith. Federal government institutions will have a new broad authority to share relevant information with banks and other financial service providers to ensure that we can all work together to put a stop to the funding of these illegal blockades. This is about following the money. This is about stopping the financing of these illegal blockades. We are today serving notice. If your truck is being used in these illegal blockades, your corporate accounts will be frozen. The insurance on your vehicle will be suspended. Send your semi-trailers home. The Canadian economy needs them to be doing legitimate work, not to be illegally making us all poorer. Il s'agit de suivre la...
It's all about following the money. It's about putting an end to the funding of these illegal blockades. Consider yourselves warned. If your truck is used in these blockades, your corporate accounts will be frozen. The insurance on your vehicle will be suspended. Send your rigs home. The Canadian economy needs them to do legitimate work and not make us all poorer illegally. We've taken these measures after deep thought. I have discussed this with the heads of Canadian banks. I thank them for doing what is necessary to ensure laws are being complied with and that Canadian democracy is being protected as well as our economy.
The past 2 years, we have trusted one another. We've leaned on one another. What we are facing today is a threat to our democratic institutions, to our economy, and to peace, order, and good government in Canada. This is unacceptable. It cannot stand, and it will not stand. Thank you. And I'll now turn over the floor to my colleague, our Attorney General, Minister of Justice, David Lametti.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. Thank you, Prime Minister, colleagues, Canadians. Good afternoon. Canada is a rule of law country. By declaring a public order emergency under the Emergencies Act, we are following the law and we are acting within it. There are clear conditions set out in the Emergencies Act in order for a public order emergency to be declared. Our government believes that those conditions have been met. And that requires the Government of Canada to act. La loi sur les mesures d'urgence.
The Emergency Measures Act has existed since 1988 and replaced the War Measures Act. It is different from the previous act in two important ways. First of all, the Emergencies Act has several ways of safeguarding measures, including parliamentary review. Secondly, measures taken under this act must comply and observe the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Specific, serious circumstances that amount to a national emergency. For a situation to be qualified as a national emergency, 3 conditions must be met. First, we must be in a situation that either seriously endangers lives, health, or safety of Canadians and exceeds the capacity or authority of a province to deal with it, or seriously threatens the ability of the Government of Canada to preserve the sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity of Canada. Second, the provinces and territories' capacity to handle the situation must be considered insufficient or must show gaps. And third, we must conclude that the situation cannot be handled adequately under any other Canadian law, including provincial laws and territorial laws. Une fois l'urgence déclarée,
once the emergency has been declared, the Emergencies Act allows the federal government to adopt rules or decrees in order to intervene. Our government respects Canadians' rights and freedoms as protected under the Charter. It is our intention to use only the necessary, reasonable and measured powers in order to resolve this crisis quickly and safely.
The Act also contains a number of significant limits, checks, and safeguards. As required by the Act earlier today, and on occasion over the past week, the Prime Minister and members of Cabinet have consulted with premiers and members of their respective governments. Having now declared a public order emergency, we will table the declaration in Parliament as required within 7 days. In the coming days, a parliamentary committee will be struck to provide oversight while the emergency is in effect. The declaration only lasts for 30 days unless renewed. However, we can and sincerely hope to revoke the emergency much sooner. Parliament also has the ability to revoke the declaration of the emergency as set out clearly in the Act. Once an emergency is declared, the Emergencies Act permits the federal government to make necessary orders or regulations to deal with the emergency. The Prime Minister gave the broad outline of these in his remarks. There are 6 specific measures we feel are needed to bring this situation under control. First, the regulation and prohibition of public assemblies that lead to a breach of peace and go beyond lawful protest. What we are seeing in Ottawa and what we are seeing at the Ambassador Bridge are not lawful protests. Second, designating and securing places where blockades are to be prohibited. This could include borders, approaches to borders, and other critical infrastructures, or Ottawa. Directing persons to render essential services to relieve impacts of blockades on Canada's economy. And this could include tow trucks and their drivers, for compensation, of course. Authorizing or directing financial institutions to render essential services to relieve the impact of blockades, including, as we have heard from the Deputy Prime Minister, regulating and prohibiting the use of property to fund or support the blockades. Measures enabling the RCMP to enforce municipal bylaws and provincial offences where required. And finally, the imposition of fines or imprisonment for a contravention of any more order or regulation made under Section 19 of the Emergencies Act. Les décrets et règlements qui permettront de
These measures that will allow us to move forward under the Act will soon be developed and tabled before Parliament in the 2 days following their implementation, as required by law. Parliament has the power to revoke the emergency, which means that all measures taken will be reasonable and appropriate.
I want to emphasize one point clearly. These measures are temporary. We intend to impose them for only as long as needed to restore order across the country. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you, Minister Lametti. The Prime Minister and ministers will be taking 30 minutes of questions, starting in the foyer. Le Premier ministre et les ministres prendront 30 minutes de questions, en commençant avec les journalistes dans la salle, starting with David Turton from CBC.
Hi, Prime Minister. A number of premiers today have come out and said that they don't want or need the federal government to exercise its emergency powers in their provinces. So I'm just wondering, how do you respond to the premiers who've come out today and said that?
I thank the premiers for having had the conversation with me this morning. It was extremely important to talk about what was happening right across the country. We have seen challenges across the country that are linked to what we are seeing here in Ottawa, what we're seeing at border crossings. But allow me to repeat what I said before. The measures brought in today are geographically specific and targeted only to where they are needed. These are not blanket powers across the country. These will be tools that can be used where and when necessary so that the police of jurisdiction dealing with blockades or occupations have the tools necessary and can draw on RCMP resources as necessary to keep Canadians safe, to restore confidence in the rule of law and in our institutions, and to make sure that our economy continues to recover from the impacts of COVID-19 over the past 2 years.
At least one other premier said that invoking this act is like putting oil on a raging fire. Words along those lines. Do you think you're inflaming the situation even more by invoking this?
My focus is on Canadians who've had a long 2 years, who've been through a pandemic, who've lost loved ones, who've seen businesses struggle, who've lost jobs, and just want this to be over. They're exhausted. We're all exhausted. We're all frustrated by the pandemic. But those people who disagree with the measures that governments put in place to keep Canadians safe, to ensure that we would make it through this pandemic better than many of our peer countries, Those people have gone from protesting and disagreeing with those measures to limiting and blocking the freedoms of their fellow citizens, hurting jobs, hurting lives and livelihoods, endangering public safety, and weakening our country not just right now, but for times to come in the eyes of our most important trading partners. These illegal blockades are hurting Canadians, and they need to stop. Every step of the way, we have been there to support the police of jurisdiction. We've been there with tools and resources to help end these blockades. But it is clear that there are more tools necessary, and that is why we are moving forward with time-limited, geographically specific, extremely bounded measures and additional powers that will allow us to get through these blockades and occupations and get back to the business of rebuilding our lives and our country after this pandemic.
Next question.
Bonjour, Monsieur Trudeau, Mac Chabot-Johnson, Radio-Canada.
Hello, Mr. Trudeau, this is Radio-Canada.
On disait, là, c'est sûr qu'il y a certains critères
As we were
qui vont
saying,
devoir être
obviously
rencontrés.
certain criteria will have to be met,
De certaines provinces ont
but
déjà dit contre.
certain premiers have already
Était
spoken out
nécessaire selon vous.
against
Est-ce que vous seriez prêt à
these
aller de
measures.
l'avant dans des provinces
Would you
qui
be
ne veulent
prepared
pas
to go
avoir
forward
un
to move forward in provinces who do not agree with the application of this act? Answer: in conversations that we're having across the country, as well as with premiers and as well as with police services, we are working on managing various situations across the country. And those conversations will continue. The Emergencies Act is there to provide us with additional tools and provide additional tools to the police services that are on site in order to manage situations as they emerge. It's not automatically an intervention by the federal police or a direct intervention by the federal government. We're here to provide more tools, including additional authorities to whichever police has jurisdiction and is there. It's quite possible, and we even hope, that the tools we have provided to police services across the country will not have to be resorted to. Certainly not for very long. Ideally, these premiers who say that they have the situation in hand will continue to be able to do so. But on a national level, we have reached criteria forcing us to act, to provide more tools to those who maintain order in our country, to protect all Canadians across the country. Question: you're saying that it's necessary. It's been through. We're in the third week of these protests in Ottawa now. Why did you not do this 2 weeks ago? Don't you think that you failed in your leadership responsibilities in moving forward on this earlier? Answer: some people will say that we moved too quickly. Other people will say, no, we should have acted weeks ago. The reality is this: the Emergencies Act is not something to take lightly. It's not the first thing you turn to, nor the second, nor the third. We were there to provide additional resources from the very beginning to Ottawa's local police service and elsewhere. We were there to support them in the work that they were doing. And in the last few days, during meetings I had with ministers, with our partners, with officials, it became clear that we required additional tools. And those tools, limited, responsible, and reasonable, are what we will be using through the Emergencies Act. Next
You
question.
mentioned that the RCMP now have the ability to enforce provincial and municipal laws. Does that mean that they'll be the lead police force agency here in Ottawa? And when can we expect more police officers from the RCMP to work with the City of Ottawa? Because they've been asking for that for a substantial period of time.
As I said, the invocation of the Emergencies Act gives more powers to the police of jurisdiction. It does not make the RCMP automatically police of jurisdiction anywhere across the country. As we have been, we will ensure that the RCMP continues to work to support local police of jurisdiction, and that's what we have been doing in Ottawa. But I think on this question, I'm happy to turn to Minister Mendicino, who can give further information on the situation in Ottawa. Marco?
Thanks very much, Prime Minister. From the very beginning of the illegal blockades, the federal government has been working closely with local law enforcement where they are the police of jurisdiction, including here in Ottawa. I would point out that we've sent 3 installments of reinforcements to ensure that that Ottawa Police Service has the support that they need. But I think, as we've seen, without question, there have been many, many challenges on the ground to restoring public order on the streets, and one only has to look at the situation on Wellington Street over the past number of weekends. I think it's difficult to overstate the impact of those scenes, the conduct that has unfolded by those who are participating in illegal blockades. It is not just an inconvenience. It is not simply a matter of a trivial interruption. We've seen intimidation, harassment, and expressions of hate. And at times, the scenes on the streets of Wellington have seemed completely lawless. And that is one of the reasons why we've had to take the very careful and deliberate step of introducing the Emergencies Act today, and the declaration and the specific powers, which again are very targeted, they're very proportionate, and they're time limited, so that there can be greater agility between the RCMP, who will work seamlessly with local law enforcement, including in Ottawa, to restore order. I would also say that while we have seen progress, for example, in Windsor, that we should not assume that that progress is linear. And that is one of the reasons why these measures through the declaration are also necessary. We want to be certain that local law enforcement has the concrete tools that they need. For example, tow trucks, which have been very hard to come by. In addition to that, the kind of Jersey barriers, which will assist with crowd control, that will ensure that trade and traffic can move very efficiently. And in addition to that, when it comes to the relationship between the RCMP and local law enforcement and provincial enforcement, the provision that is within the declaration will allow the RCMP to be more efficiently assigned to those areas to uphold the law, be they municipal laws, provincial laws, or indeed the designated zones which will be prohibited from assembly because they may cause a breach of peace or may interrupt our critical infrastructure through trade. So when you look at the suite of the measures that we put into place today, and we've certainly put a lot of thought into that, our view is that they are necessary and they will assist us in dealing with the illegal blockades and bringing them to a peaceful and expeditious resolution.
As my follow-up, Mr. Trudeau, Mr. Mendicino just mentioned that when you look out on Wellington Street here, you see lawless scenes. Why do you have any faith that the Ottawa Police, after 3 weeks now, is going to be able to turn things around and restore law and order in this area?
In regards to the Ottawa Police, we have been working closely, not just the RCMP, but the OPP, to ensure that there is a coordinated approach on that. But in terms of confidence in the police, I think we could do worse than turn to our Minister of Emergency Preparedness, Bill Blair, to respond to that. Bill.
Yeah, thank you very much, Prime Minister, and good afternoon, everyone. The Ontario Ottawa Police Service remains the police of jurisdiction in the City of Ottawa. But the police services right across Canada and certainly in Ontario have been coming together. And they recently announced on Friday the formation of an integrated command structure for managing this event. And that really brings the resources and the capacities of the OPP and the RCMP to the assistance of the Ottawa Police. We've also had conversations with other police agencies across Ontario, and they recognize the situation here and the importance of ensuring that there are adequate resources. But it's not simply an issue of resources, but also of authorities. And we have been working from the very outset with the municipality and with the province in order to ensure that our police services here in Ottawa and right across Canada have the authorities they need and the resources they need to do the important job. Now, as I said yesterday, policing is a very important institution in our society. We need the police to do their job of upholding our laws, to maintain the rule of law, and to maintain public order and safety in our communities. And we have a responsibility to make sure that they have the resources and the tools that they need to do that job. They have our support. And as that support grows in the City of Ottawa, I have confidence that they'll be able to restore order with the support that we're providing.
Next question.
Hi, Prime Minister. Stephanie Taylor with the Canadian Press. You emphasized we're not calling in the military to deal with the situation, but all options, as you said last week, are on the table. So what would it take for you to bring the military into this situation? What would the criteria be, and what would it take for you to make that decision?
I'm not going to engage in hypotheticals right now. I think what is most important is that Canadians get their lives back, their communities back, their neighborhoods back, and can once again rely on their jobs and the trade and the supply chains that are supporting them and putting food on their tables. The reality is the measures that we put forward today, which have been carefully thought through, will give the tools to law enforcement to be able to move in even stronger and clearer ways against these illegal protests, these illegal occupations, and blockades that are hurting Canadians. We will continue to monitor, and we will continue to do the things necessary to keep Canadians safe. But like I said, this Emergencies Act in no way brings in the military as a solution against Canadians. We are empowering law enforcement. I think that's what Canadians want to see.
Over the weekend, Minister Blair expressed that he was a little baffled by the lack of law enforcement he saw. I want to know what you think. Do you agree with him that it is a little baffling the Ottawa police are not enforcing more of the laws? What do you make of the policing you have seen to date on Wellington Street and elsewhere in Ottawa?
I think there is a high level of frustration amongst residents of Ottawa that this situation has gone on as long as it has. Certainly the frustration people feel in Ottawa has been echoed across the country and indeed around the world. And it is important that the police of jurisdiction working with the OPP and the RCMP are able to put an end to these illegal protests. The specific and limited measures that we are putting forward today as part of the Emergencies Act will give them further tools that in their coordinated response between the Ottawa Police Services, the OPP and the RCMP working together should be able to respond to these concerns by the citizens of Ottawa who want their cities back.
We'll take one last question in the foyer before turning to the phone.
Yeah, Prime Minister, Ryan Hamilton, National Post. Over the weekend, Mayor Jim Watson here in Ottawa made a deal with protest organizers to move more trucks onto Wellington Street and out of residential areas. I'm wondering if you can give me any reaction to that deal.
I know that the City of Ottawa, its police services and its elected officials have been pursuing an end to these blockades. This has gone on far too long. It is no longer a lawful protest at a disagreement over government policy. It is now an illegal occupation. It is time for people to go home. The measures that we've put forward today will be additional tools for law enforcement at all levels to be able to secure an end to these blockades.
You're announcing today rules around preventing banks from dealing with these illegal blockades. The City of Ottawa has dealt with these legal blockades. Don't you find that problematic that they have cut a deal to put more trucks directly in front of Parliament Hill?
We are working in a concerted way on measures that will hopefully restore order to the City of Ottawa and allow residents to get back to their lives. The measures that we put forward today around empowering banks to follow up and to ensure that funds are not used for illegal activities such as blockades will be significantly helpful in reducing the size and impact of these blockades.
Merci. On va maintenant tourner au téléphone.
Thank you. We will now move to the telephone. Operator, go ahead.
Please press star 1 at this time if you have a question. S'il vous plaît, appuyez sur étoile 1 maintenant pour poser une question. The first question will be from, la première question va être de Raymond Fillon, TVA. Please go ahead.
First question is from TVA. Raymond Fillon, please go ahead. Thank you. Prime Minister, when will the special powers under the Emergencies Act come into effect for police officers that you've announced today? Answer. The impact of this declaration is immediate. We will be developing specific proposals and policies in the coming hours, the coming days, that will have specific impacts. But I will ask the Minister of Justice to tell you more. Thank you, Prime Minister. Thank you, Mr. Fillon. We will be tabling orders in Council under the Act. Once these measures have been announced, they become effective immediately. And then there will be parliamentary review, but the orders and decrees come into effect immediately. Thank you. Question. Mr. Trudeau, several people reproached you for your tone towards the protesters over the last couple of weeks. They said you threw oil on the flames. Do you feel any responsibility for the scope that these protests have reached? Answer. What we've seen and what we are now seeing across Canada is that, of course, people are tired, frustrated, sick of the pandemic, tired of public health measures. They want it to be over. Everyone agrees on that. But what we have also seen is that Canadians across the country were there for each other. We're there to help one another, to follow public health guidelines, to get vaccinated at a higher rate than in most of our peer countries across the world. We have shown as a country that people continue to be there for one another. Now, people who are seeing their lives disrupted by these blockades here in Ottawa, seeing people suffering because borders are being blockaded that are preventing people from doing their jobs and are curtailing our supply chains. Those people are angry and even sicker of that. They want us to act, to restore order in our country, to show that we are a country of rule of law. Well, yes, we do in this country encourage peaceful protests. We encourage people to openly and loudly express their opinions, but we do not accept people who come and curtail other people's freedoms, their fellow citizens' freedoms, and break the laws and use illegal means to protest.
Thank you. Merci. The next question is from, la prochaine question est de Tonda McCharles, Toronto Star. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Thank you. Prime Minister, I didn't hear an answer to the question Mac asked about reinforcements from the RCMP to the City of Ottawa, and if you can answer that, great. But how specifically do you justify giving even more powers to police in Ottawa when many residents and policing experts say the law enforcement here has not used the power they already have under existing laws, that this is a failure of policing leadership, not the need for more power?
There will be time later to reflect on all the lessons that can be learned from this situation. Right now, we are ensuring that local police of jurisdiction have both the legal authorities that they need to do their jobs, but also the extra resources. We have delivered not just RCMP officers, as the OPP has delivered OPP officers to support the City of Ottawa, but we've also provided integrated planning and coordination task force to ensure that we are able to actually see an end to this occupation of Ottawa.
Following up.
Yes, I'd like you to speak, if you could. You mentioned, as did Minister Freeland, the reputational damage to the country that you feel the border protests have had and the impact on Canada's, I guess, reputation as a reliable trading partner. But can you speak a little bit more about just what was the tipping point for you in all of this? Was it really the fact that the White House has been weighing in and burning up the phone lines all weekend to all your ministers? Really, why have you moved to do this?
For me, the conversations I had with our Windsor MP, Eric Kazmierczak, who was talking about the impact of the disruption of the Ambassador Bridge almost as soon as it started happening, the impact on workers in the auto sector in the Windsor area and up the supply chain through southern Ontario, the direct impact hurting exactly the people that these convoy protesters are purporting to represent. Regular Canadians are hurting in their jobs, in our economic recovery, in their freedoms to travel, to see friends and loved ones on the other side of the border, because of illegal protests and barricades. We have been there to support local polices of jurisdiction, and we are now putting forward fresh tools to do that. In terms of the reputational damage, in my conversations with fellow leaders around the world on the situation in Ukraine and others, it has been clear that this is something that democracies around the world are concerned with. Countries that did well during the pandemic with high vaccination rates and strong public health measures are still seeing backlashes against those measures and frustration by people who are tired of this pandemic. And the impact of social media and illicit funding of concerted activities designed to destabilize a country that has the highest vaccination rate of many of our peer countries, Canada, around an issue that is not dividing Canadians. Canadians are united in having been there for each other through this pandemic, and they're even united in being sick and tired of this pandemic. But the way to get through it is not to shut down our economy and hurt our neighbors. And that's something that people understand around the world. And with this measure here today showing that Canada remains a country of the rule of law, that will protect its critical infrastructure, that will support good jobs, that deliver goods and services, not just to Canadians, but people around the world, are going to be protected.
Opératrice, prochaine question téléphone.
Operator, next question, please.
Merci. The next question is from, la prochaine question est de Boris Proulx, Le Devoir.
The next question is from Le Devoir. Please go ahead. Good afternoon, Prime Minister. What proof do you have that provincial capacities are not sufficient to deal with this situation? Answer. I'm very pleased to hand the floor to Minister Lametti to answer that question. Minister Lametti. Thank you for the question, Boris. Obviously, the answer can be found across Canada. And the answer can also be found in the measures we're going to be taking. Of course, we're going to support police services across the country and provide them resources that they need. But I would direct your attention to measures announced by the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance today. It's the ability to block the use of private property, such as trucks, which, and if you look at the flags that you're seeing across Wellington Street, you can see several different flags with Canadian, Albertan, Quebec flags. These trucks are registered across Canada. And I thank Mr. Ford for having taken measures in Ontario. But what we've done today will allow us either to do something here in Ottawa or at the borders or elsewhere, or through our financial services in Canada, it will help us unblock the streets. How? Because this applies across Canada. And under such measures, under such an act, we can do so. We cannot do so through provincial legislation. Follow-up question? Yes. Minister, what if a province does not want you to apply these measures in their province? Can they ask to be excluded from them? Answer, no, under the Act. And in fact, the Act was drafted by Mr. Mulroney's Conservatives in 1988. We have the duty to consult provinces, which we did. Of course, we will continue to collaborate with provinces, which we have done and we will continue to do. But once a national emergency has been declared, these measures apply across the whole country. One last question on the telephone.
Thank you. Merci.
Just a quick follow-up. Obviously, these rules apply across Canada. But the tools that we are offering, the measures we will use will not be applied across the entire country. They will only be applied where they are truly necessary, by working with local jurisdictions. So even though, theoretically, yes, the impact, since it is a federal act, would apply across the whole country, it will only have a concrete impact where it is truly needed. And that is not everywhere in Canada, of course. Operator.
Merci. The next question is from La dernière question est de Marieke Walsh, de Globe and Mail. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister. Minister Lemitti, if I understood him, said that this will apply across Canada and that provinces will not be able to opt out. Your opening statement said that this would be geographically targeted. So can you please explain where specifically in Canada this will apply?
I actually just answered that in French, and I'm happy to repeat it because it is an important point that people need to understand. The Emergency Measures Act, as it is applied when it is a national emergency that touches more than one province, as this one is, necessarily covers the entire country because it is a federal National Emergencies Act. However, the specific provisions that we have laid out in the Act, the measures necessary, will only apply where they are needed. We talked about geographically limited, obviously, to continue to ensure that the Ambassador Bridge remains free and clear for traffic. That is a place where the measures brought in by this Emergencies Act will matter. A small community elsewhere in the country, a long way from borders or critical infrastructure that is not experiencing any significant illegal protests are unlikely to see any impact from these the Emergency Act. This is the element that is limited to where it is needed. And indeed, in places where there is a significant border crossing, where the local police of jurisdiction have no need of additional RCMP support or even the additional tools that we have made available to them, they will not have to use those additional tools. So even though the Emergencies Act applies to the entire country, it is targeted, time-limited, and geographically specific based on need as to where it will actually be felt and have an impact on the ground.
Following up.
Thank you. So can you please clarify then, will it apply in Emerson, Manitoba, Coutts, Alberta, and Surrey, BC? And how will you measure the success of this, that this is not just your government appearing to do something, but that actual results happen?
Well, I think Canadians know well that the measure of success will be, can we get our supply chains back? Can we end the disruption to livelihoods of people who rely on trade to the United States from these border crossings? Can the citizens of Ottawa get back to their daily lives, including, as we saw just a few weeks ago, when a perfectly peaceful protest involving tractors and trucks of potatoes from PEI were on Parliament Hill highlighting their concerns. That is how this country needs to work and how protests can and should unfold. But this illegal occupation needs to end, and that is where we have now given the specific tools necessary for that. In regards to Emerson and Coutts, one of the issues that we have seen is a challenge in getting tow trucks to actually show up to bring out, to move these large rigs. In Windsor, we relied on generous partnership with the Americans to be able to get tow trucks to move the big trucks. Now, with these measures that we've put in place, there will be an ability to compel, for just compensation, tow truck owners and operators to actually do the jobs for which they have contracts with various orders of government to keep highways and roads clear. This is an example of a specific tool that is now available to local police of jurisdiction in places all across the country if needed. It will be to them to determine whether or not that is needed.
Merci beaucoup. C'est ce qui met fin à la conférence de presse d'aujourd'hui.
Thank you. This brings today's press conference to an end. Thank you, everyone.
And that is an extraordinary announcement by the Prime Minister of Canada and his cabinet ministers that for the first time since its creation in 1988, his cabinet has invoked the Emergencies Act to allow for special powers, new powers for police enforcement to deal with these blockades and convoys we've seen right across the country. David Cochrane joins me now to give me his perspective from what you heard there, David.
Well, Rosie, there's sort of 6 big components that they outlined here today. Many of them were expected once we learned the news that this was coming. The prohibition of public assembly, for example, securing specific places such as the Ambassador Bridges, no-go zones for protests, compelling essential services, as the Prime Minister just talked about, forcing tow truck companies to live up to their contracts and help clear roads and areas, letting the RCMP enforce laws in municipal jurisdictions and in bumping up fines and improvements. The new stuff there today are the financial measures outlined and reinforced by Chrystia Freeland. GoFundMe, Give, Send, Go, all the crowdfunding now going to be subject to money laundering and terrorism financing laws and have to disclose large transactions to FinTrack for monitoring, a greater level of scrutiny there. But more importantly, the trucks. Chrystia Freeland saying if your truck is part of these protests, your corporate account will be frozen, your insurance will be canceled.
The Prime Minister also saying the Emergencies Act, David, should be used sparingly and as a last resort. With that, I'll send viewers back to your Olympic coverage on CBC Television. David Cochrane's up next with Power and Politics.
I'm David Cochrane, and you're watching Power and Politics. That was Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announcing his cabinet has invoked the Emergencies Act to respond to protests. Also speaking, Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, Justice Minister David Lametti. The CBC's Hannah Thibodeau has been listening in along with us. She joins me now live from Ottawa. So, Hannah, when you look at the measures that were outlined there by the government,